In 2010, Egypt had reached a boiling point, and no one could have predicted the events that were to unfold in the following 12 months. Former President Hosni Mubarak had been ruling the country under emergency powers for over 30 years. But after the revolution in Tunisia, people in Egypt felt that they too could overturn their regime.
We are talking about a state that is deeply against an act of revolt.
They were an unstoppable wave of protests going through the streets. Riot police went out that day armed with live ammunition. And they used that and they killed protesters.
I was beaten up by the police that day, dragged on the ground.
I did not particularly think it was going to be a revolution, but I thought this is something big and this is something I don't want to miss taking part in.
Hosni Mubarak's regime had repeatedly brushed aside calls for reform, and then there was talk of his son Jamal lined up to succeed him as president. It was against this backdrop that seismic events began to unfold in Tunisia, which were quickly noticed at home. What ignited the Egyptian revolution in 2011?
The tipping point was the inspiration of Tunisia, because seeing Ben Ali fall, that inspired this idea that maybe that could happen in Egypt also.
Lina Atallah is editor-in-chief of independent news outlet Mada Masr. In 2020, she was named one of Time magazine's most influential people for her reporting on the Egyptian regime.
We were following very closely what's happening in Tunisia, but we were very skeptical, and we were unfortunately in the belief that what happened in Tunisia is not necessarily going to happen in Egypt. So I didn't manage to line up reporters to cover what happened on the Tuesday, January 25th.
If you think back to the Kafaya movement in 2005, you first started having protests related to domestic politics instead of just foreign policy. You then had sort of the movement of independent judges. You had 2008, the birth of the April 6th movement, at the same time as Mahalla protests, or rising labor protests, very, very corrupt elections in 2010, and the exclusion of any opposition, and then the Khalid Said case.
Police brutality had been widespread in Egypt. In the 5 years before the revolution, the Mubarak regime denied the existence of torture or abuse by police, but the evidence suggested otherwise. It became clear Egypt was ready for reform.
I'm a revolutionary, or used to be a revolutionary. I always like to identify myself as I'm a co-founder of No Military Trials for Civilians movement.
When Muna Saif's parents, who were both well-known human rights activists, decided to have a child, her father had already been convicted in absentia for years. Ahmed Saif al-Islam only turned himself in once he was sure his wife, Layla, was pregnant. And so for the first 3 years of her life, Muna's father was behind bars. Despite her parents' work, she'd grown up largely disinterested in politics.
For me and my sister, and I think even my brother, our way of rebelling was to be completely apolitical when we were younger. So I was disengaging completely from everything that was happening. My sister as well, we were rebelling against this, being aware and being, and then, well, it just didn't work.
Everything changed on January 25th, 2011. Muna became aware of the Khalid Said movement on Facebook. Saeed was a young man from Alexandria. In mid-2010, police dragged him out of an internet cafe, but before he even reached the police station, the officers beat him to death in the street.
The grocery store nearby saw him, his neighbors saw him, and he was killed. And then the state tried to cover it up as they do with any torture cases. It wasn't the first torture case to cause a scandal in Egypt, nor the first torture case to be investigated. But this one was just different in terms of the reaction on the street.
January 25th was a public holiday in Egypt, a day to honor the work of the police. The Khaled Said Facebook page mobilized its young followers to protest on that day against his death and against rampant police brutality. It came as no surprise that the demonstrators were met with violence that day.
So there was a very deliberate reason to choose to start that first protest on Tuesday, January 25th. Because it was anger against the Ministry of Interior, it was anger against the police, who were really kings in Mubarak's Egypt. They felt that they were above the law. Mubarak ruled under the emergency law for decades.
I did not particularly think it was going to be a revolution, but I thought this is something big and this is something I don't want to miss taking part in. And I just found myself there. I found myself there with thousands of other people, some I know and many people I don't know. We've never felt such sense of belonging to a group, a huge mass of strangers. This is something that is very alien to Egyptians, especially Egyptian women. So this was something very empowering.
The revolution did not have a very complete political project, and revolutions are not necessarily expected to have a complete political project when they erupt. We are talking about a state that is deeply against an act of revolt, and accordingly there was no chance for the revolution to articulate a political project for itself.
صور مظاهرة سلمية بيتم فضها بالقوة، غاز وخرطوش، بلا قانون تظاهر، الشارع لينا، مفيش مظاهرة بأمر حد، مفيش مظاهرة بأمر حد.
The violence escalated quickly, and 3 days later, the first person was killed.
But on January 28th, people they were an unstoppable wave of protests going through the streets. And the police met them with a lot of violence. There was tear gas, but there was also rubber pellets from the start, but most significantly live ammo. So the riot police went out that day armed with live ammunition. And they used that and they killed protesters.
I was beaten up by the police that day. I dragged on the ground and then taken to a police car, and then I was released shortly after. And this is the point at which I realized that this is going to be big.
So going from Black Wednesday at the beginning of February, when the shooting started, the shooting was for people with rifles on the bridge and on neighboring buildings, especially from the side of the Egyptian Museum. I think this was the first time for people in the square to realize that the army is not with the people as they are claiming, because this side was severely guarded by the army. It was next to the Egyptian Museum, so there were lots of tanks, and they did nothing to prevent the attack. They did nothing to stop it, they did nothing to protect us.
So for me, it was always clear that the military was not on the side of the protesters. I think the reason this narrative was cultivated at the time is that the military could have obviously stepped in to shut down the protests using even more violence than the police did at the time. And the military chose not to, we found out later on, because parts of the military were in favor of the overthrow of Mubarak because they were against his plan to hand over power to his son.
Mubarak stepped down on February 11th, 2011.
قرر الرئيس محمد حسني مبارك تخليه عن منصب رئيس الجمهورية.
Tens of thousands of Egyptians rejoiced in the streets. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces took power and pledged to draft a new constitution and elect a new government within 6 months.
We celebrated, but it felt like there's things still needs to be done. Most of the people were very naively confident that the military is going to protect them. And I remember minutes before the vicious attack, a young man was covering himself in blanket on the floor and saying, "We are absolutely fine, they are here."
The protests and violence continued throughout the year, with thousands of arrests and detentions. More than 12,000 people were brought before military tribunals.
عرفنا ان هو اتنقل زنزانة تأديب فعلا وان هم حطوه في زنزانة جنب عنبر الإعدام.
For Muna Saif, a turning point was witnessing the arrest of an activist named Omar Bahiri.
I didn't know much about military trials. All I knew is that me and my mother were witnesses to his innocence. And so we started reaching out to everyone who was in contact with the military. We started writing our testimonies. And then 48 hours later, we found out that he had been referred to military tribunal. He got sentenced to 5 years in prison. I contacted one of the lawyers who actually was working with the IPR, and we started following the case of Amr al-Bahiri. He went to the military court, and he called me, and he was like, "This is unbelievable. There are so many families here. This has been going on for the past 2 weeks without us knowing." So we started. And then the big thing that was like a turning point for the revolutionary core was March 9th. So March 9th, there was an order to end any sit-in that was still remaining in Tahrir Square, even though it was very small. They completely evacuated it very violently. They arrested so many protesters. This is the night where hundreds were immediately referred to military trials. And this is also when the girls were submitted to forced virginity checks.
What many in Egypt had been fighting for, free and fair elections, finally took place in June of 2012. Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was narrowly elected president, but it wasn't long before dissent began to grow.
Morsi gets elected, but now there's a coup. Yes, so it doesn't happen immediately, right? Because Morsi wins the elections in June of 2012, and then the coup happens basically a year later. And I think the things that led to the coup being possible were a number of things. Morsi passed a constitutional decree, but the fact that that decree included the provision that he would set himself up beyond judicial review was too reminiscent of the Mubarak era, and it was seen as a massive power grab, basically, by the Muslim Brotherhood. The second thing that happened was the Hadaya Protests. December 5th, there was a protest outside the presidential palace, outside gate number 4, which is sort of one of the closest gates to get to the president's office. And what ended up happening that night is that there were scuffles between Brotherhood supporters who gathered outside the presidential palace and activists who were protesting against Morsi's rule. And the Brotherhood then basically organized a little detention cell outside presidential palace gate number 4. They ended up citizen arresting and detaining over 24 of the protesters and beating them up and filming this and putting this on a Brotherhood TV station saying, who's paying you? Why are you here? And that ended any support that the pro-uprising or the human rights community could have had for the Muslim Brotherhood, because the president couldn't pretend he didn't know when this was happening outside gate number 4 of the presidential palace.
In July 2013, Amid large-scale protests against Morsi's government, the Egyptian army took matters into its own hands. Led by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Morsi was pushed from office in a military coup.
إجراء انتخابات رئاسية مبكرة على أن يتولى رئيس المحكمة الدستورية العليا إدارة شؤون البلاد خلال المرحلة الانتقالية ولحين انتخاب رئيساً جديداً.
A few weeks later, el-Sisi's forces staged a crackdown on Morsi's supporters in Rabaa Square in Cairo. Hundreds were killed, including many women and children. Egypt's revolution was over.
We knew that they were going to disperse the protests. I'm never going to forget that I had to count 345 bodies that were laid out in the mosque the day after the protest. And I'm never going to forget the sound of gunfire and the sight of people who were fleeing the protest site. Half of the country is traumatized because they have relatives or friends who were caught up in the Rabaa massacre, and then the other half is in a very unhealthy pace of denial, pretending that this didn't happen in the middle of Cairo during the day.
El-Sisi's crackdown extended to media outlets critical of his regime. Among them, journalists and independent liberal news sites like Mada Masr.
We like to call it a child of crisis. We felt that there was no place left for us to practice independent journalism but our own space. So Mada was created in these circumstances with the main objective of bearing witness to what we believed was going to be a very difficult summer and difficult ensuing years. So Mada Masr was banned in 2017. It was one of the first few websites that were blocked in Egypt. It was an unusual policy of blocking because Egypt doesn't usually block websites. Egypt has more of a policy of jailing the people who act in a way online that the government doesn't like, which continues to be the case. We have up to 1,000 websites of different forms and shapes that are being blocked.
Along with the crackdown, the severity of sentences increased under el-Sisi, and new laws were introduced aimed at cementing the powers of his regime. Prominent secular activists, women's rights campaigners, and Muslim Brotherhood members were handed long prison terms, and many protesters were held for long periods without charge. The year after Morsi was forced out, an Egyptian court sentenced 529 people to death over the murder of a police officer in the city of Minya during riots.
We also see much more violence in policing under Sisi. So, for example, extrajudicial executions didn't happen in the context of regular law enforcement. And it's become normal to see the Ministry of Interior publish press releases saying, we entered an apartment in Alexandria and liquidated 6 terrorists we found there. That just did not happen in the Mubarak era. And these days, it doesn't even surprise you when you see it because it's become so normalized. And the other big thing is just the cruelty of treatment in prisons.
Muna Saif's older brother is Ala Abdel Fattah, a blogger who helped set up social media platforms in Egypt, many of which the regime wanted to suppress. Now, he's Egypt's most famous political prisoner. Among other charges, he's accused of publishing fake news.
During Sisi's ruling, Ali has been almost always in prison. He has been in prison since end of 2013 till now, except for a few months in between. And my sister as well. So 2014 was, my sister is the youngest, Saneh. She's 26 years old. She's turning 27 very soon. And also, just under the current regime, under Sisi's regime, she has been in prison 3 times. So it seems like this regime cannot see our family except as prisoners. I'm lucky to be outside I think part of my protection is because my siblings are in prison.
Life for women in Egypt under el-Sisi became much worse. New laws, which on the surface were supposed to tackle cybercrimes, were actually used to target female activists. Some online posts denouncing sexual assault were framed by the regime as threats to national security.
How would you assess the women's rights under el-Sisi as opposed to Mubarak?
I think in a sense, the feminist movement in Egypt predates the human rights community. And we've often had a lot of state feminism in Egypt. I mean, Suzanne Mubarak kind of would pick up different issues as a pet project. In the Sisi era, there isn't really that kind of champion on the legislative level in terms of what we've seen from him. Interestingly, one of the worst things that started to happen in protests in Egypt from 2012 onwards are cases of mass mobbing, of women being gang raped, of women being sexually attacked by mobs, very often in Tahrir, and very, very scary because it could be groups of sort of 50 or 60 men at the same time attacking women.
With no serious competitors and no international election monitoring, Sisi was re-elected for a second term in office in 2018. The Election Commission claimed he received 97% of the vote. Today, Egypt's problems are still visible from outside the country.
Speaking out in Egypt today is dangerous.
Hollywood actress Scarlett Johansson was one of the many campaigners who successfully called for civil rights workers to be freed from detention.
Gasser, Karim, Mohammed, and Zaki from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights.
Can we do a little comparison? Let's say freedom of speech. What is it like now? What was it like before?
Just objectively speaking, the situation today in Egypt is significantly worse. If you look at the number of journalists in prison today, if you look at the number of human rights defenders in prison today, random Egyptians who posted stuff on Facebook that the security agencies didn't like, the numbers are crazy.
Basma Mustafa is a journalist from Cairo, but she fled to Lebanon with her husband Karim and their 2 daughters after being arrested by Egyptian police twice in 2020. The second detention happened while she was trying to cover a story in Luxor.
حياتي بقت مهددة بسبب شغلي الصحفي. اللي حصل إن أنا سافرت الأقصر. ضميري المهني يعني شايف إنه في اللحظة دي أنا مفروض أكون هناك. نزلت بس من الأتوبيس فضابط من اللي كانوا في الكمين خبطني برجله على ظهري من ورا. نايمني على الأرض كده وقال لي سيب الموبايل.
Basma was taken to the Egyptian National Security Headquarters and interrogated 4 different times. She was accused of publishing stories that incited hatred against the police. Each interrogation lasted 2 hours, and each time she was blindfolded.
هم في الآخر قالوا لي إن أنا ماشية، قالوا لي يعني إنه ده تحقيق بسيط وإن أنت هتمشي هتمشي في الآخر يعني. ولا الحقيقة كنت مصدقة إن أنا ماشية، يعني كنت مصدقة إن هو مجرد تحقيق وهمشي، ما كنتش متخيلة إن الموضوع هيوصل إن أنا أروح نيابة يعني. كان في مئات من المتظاهرين كله قاعد في الأرض وكله إيديه متكلبشة وكلهم مستنيين العرض يعني. بعد كده اترحلت على سجن القناطر، ويسرت السجن دي بقى كانت صاحية مستنياني. فأول ما دخلت قالت لي أنت السياسية اللي بيقولوا عليها إن هي جاية، فقلت لها أنا مش سياسية أنا صحفية. فقالت لي طب يلا بقى عشان تنامي، فقلت لها بفكر هنام فين، ومفيش مكان أصلاً إن أنا أقف مش عشان أنام.
عندنا في مصر في 3 اتهامات رئيسية بتوجهها السلطات وأجهزة الأمن لأي حد بيتقبض عليه. هم 3 اتهامات ثابتين بيتاخدوا كوبي وبست. هم أول حاجة الانضمام لجماعة إرهابية دون أن يتم ذكر إيه هي الجماعة دي، ونشر الأخبار الكاذبة التي من شأنها الإضرار بالسلم العام دون ذكر إيه هي الأخبار دي، إيه هي المادة اللي شكلت الجريمة. والاتهام الثالث هو إساءة استخدام وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي.
Basma was released after 5 days, something she attributes to the international campaign calling for her freedom. Her plan was to stay in Cairo, but when police started patrolling her neighborhood after her release, she decided to move to Beirut.
كان بيتعمد انه لما يجي لي البيت انه ما يقابلنيش، بس كان يتعمد انه يقابل الجيران، يقابل السوبر ماركت اللي جنب البيت، يسأل عليا. فاعتقد ان دي كانت رسائل طول الوقت ان احنا متابعينك وان احنا عارفين كل تحركاتك وعارفين انت بتعملي ايه. لاول مره على مدار 10 سنين اقف اسال نفسي هل انا قادره في الوقت ده اشتغل؟ هل انا قادره انشر الموضوع عندي؟ فحسيت انه خلاص يعني ده الوقت اللي انا لازم امشي فيه.
Basma's story is far from unique. The Egyptian state is accused of running a systematic, oppressive campaign against journalists and human rights activists, like the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, or EIPR.
فاللي حصل مع المبادرة هو تصعيد خطير جدا وغير مسبوق في التعامل مع منظمات حقوق الإنسان، وده فيه رسالة يعني المستهدف منه مش بس المبادرة المصرية، هو بيوجه رسالة للمنظمات اللي موجودة في مصر وللمجتمع الدولي إن هو ما عندوش تنازل في الملف ده، وإن هو مصر على إن القيود اللي مفروضة على المنظمات وعلى المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان تفضل موجودة، وبيوضح إن ما فيش أي إرادة سياسية للدولة إنها تغير أو تصلح في ملف حقوق الإنسان بأي شكل من الأشكال.
Alaa is now back in prison. He's in harsher conditions than before. He's in maximum security Tora prison too. It's been a year. He's been completely deprived of sun. He's locked in with 2 cellmates. Not allowed any books, any radio. We were only allowed letters from him when COVID epidemic hit. These are Alaa's letters. So basically, he writes to us, and then every letter he draws something for Dodo, for his son. Alaa is not allowed paper and pen in cell. So what actually happens is that every time we send him a letter, they bring him to the office of the officer. He reads the letter and he does this on the spot in front of them. He responds, he draws, and he hands it over. And then of course they can scratch out anything they don't particularly like. With Saneva, things are different because she's in much better conditions in another prison. So I get her books. She made me a scarf present. She made the mama bookmark. I just managed finally to get her some yarn last visit, so she can do some handcrafted stuff. I truly believe now that for as long as this regime is in power, this close association with the prisons my family has will not be resolved. And it will only be resolved either by the end of this regime, or by us all being in prison, all the family, or by us finally managing to be out of reach.
Egypt today is a difficult and dangerous place, especially if you're perceived as a threat to the regime. Even still, many journalists and activists are willing to carry on campaigning to keep the spirit of the Arab Spring alive.
We continue with this sentiment that what we're doing is important and that so long as we are still here and free, chances are we should try and continue doing what we're doing. So I guess this is how we managed to continue. There is very little hope, really. So I think it's not a question of saying that there is grand hope that lies somewhere that promises big changes. It's a question of being attentive to the small details on an everyday level through which we can be able to operate.
Despite what we are experiencing right now, despite being really under the bloodiest regime we've ever dealt with, I feel genuinely grateful to January 25th and to 2011. I owe who I am now to it. It seems weird, but there wasn't a moment where I felt I regretted. This no longer feels like, to me, like a battle for change or to continue what we were hoping for in January 25th. To me, this feels like a survival matter.